The movie begins with a view of a small town in Indiana where Jilly, a young man working in a pet shelter, is standing on one of the buildings looking at the view. In the background, Jilly monologues about loneliness, relationships, and abandonment issues, which a counselor had told him stems from being raised in an orphanage. Driving his car around with a white cat in a small cage, Jilly arrives at a home where he picks up a stray cat with a collar that reads Ringo. Taking the cats to the shelter, Jilly drops them off and is cornered by his boss Larry, who begs him to come over to his house for dinner. The following morning, Jilly and Larry head over to a nearby dinner for lunch, Larry still frustrated about his ungrateful family. While they're conversing, their construction worker friend Stuart joins them and takes off his hat to reveal a horrendous haircut. Holding back a laugh, the two men ask him what happened to his hair, and Stuart explains that he just received a trim from the most beautiful woman in town. Ignoring his friend's comments about how bad it looked, Stuart assures them the woman was worth the price of looking silly. Curious about the girl, Jilly heads over to the hair salon and takes a look at her through the window, finally deciding to get a haircut so he could meet her. After waiting for a few minutes until his turn, Jilly takes his seat in front of the woman's chair and begins a conversation while she works on his hair. After a brief introduction, Jilly notices a picture of Joe holding a cat and finds out it had disappeared 2 weeks ago. When he finds out the cat's name is Ringo, Jilly mentions that he had rescued a cat with a missing tail by the same name, causing Joe to cut off a piece of his ear from excitement. Jilly is rushed to the emergency room where the doctors reattach the missing piece of his ear. When he leaves the emergency room, he finds Joe waiting for him and begs him to come over to her house so she can cook him dinner. After assuring her that she doesn't need to feel guilty about what happened, Jilly graciously accepts the invitation. At her home, Joe rushes to make Jilly dinner, while her mother, Valdine, badgers her about leaving her wealthy boyfriend, Jack. Ignoring her mother, Joe continues her preparation and then rushes to the door when she hears the doorbell ring. During dinner, Valdine shows her disapproval of Jilly by making jokes about his chosen career of being a vet. After an awkward interaction with Joe's father, Walter, who was paralyzed after being hit by a stroke, Jilly quickly leaves. The following day, Jilly meets the local detective, who is helping Jilly find his biological parents. After another disappointing news, Jilly meets up with Joe on the rooftop of his workplace, where they enjoy a little picnic. As they talk about how horrible Jilly feels every time a puppy is put down, Joe is moved by his passion, and the two passionately kiss. And after that night, the two begin a new relationship and spend a lovely 6 months together. Realizing that Joe is the one for him, Jilly prepares a little picnic on the roof where they had their first date and asks Joe to marry him, feeling ecstatic once she accepts. That night, they celebrate their new engagement in Jilly's bed when he receives a message from his detective friend Vic, who informs him that his mother's name is Valdine. The shock hits both Jilly and Joe like a train when they confront Valdine and find out the truth that she is really his mother. She explains that she had to give Jilly away because they were very poor when he was born, unable to raise 2 children at the same time. 16 months later, Jilly has lost the love of his life and has become the butt of the town's jokes after it came out that he had slept with his sister. Unwilling to face him after what had happened, Joe had left the town, writing Jilly only a goodbye letter. Although he had become the joke of the town, he was able to nurture a relationship with his newfound parents. One afternoon, after receiving the shocking news that Joe was getting married, Jilly sulks in sadness in his parents' house when Valdine suddenly hears the doorbell. When she answers the door, she is shocked to see a young man who looked remarkably like her husband when he was young. After they let him inside, the young man explains that he was the son they had given up for adoption, making Jilly a total stranger. Angered by the news, Valdine and Walter kick Jilly out of the house, announcing that they weren't his parents. Having heard the amazing news, Jilly drives out to find Joe and tell her the amazing news. After driving for several hours through the night, Jilly accidentally hits an amputee hitchhiker. Shocked, Jilly runs out of the car and checks on the man, who seems to have not sustained any damages. Introducing himself as Dig, the stranger explains that he is a stranded pilot in need of a ride. When the two men finally arrive at the nearby town where Jilly had heard Joe was living with her boyfriend, Dig says his goodbyes and warns him about being wary of the locals. Meanwhile, Valdine calls the town's police station and informs them that a man by the name of Jilly will arrive soon and warns them that he is a sexual predator who assaulted his sister. Deputy Officer Gina, who was in love with Jack, Joe's fiancé, begins to spread the rumor all over the place in hopes of embarrassing Joe. Seeing the posters on the street, Joe immediately calls her mother and asks her what happened. Fearing that her daughter would call off the wedding if she knew the truth, Valdine keeps the recently revealed information, making Jilly out to be a crazy person. While taking a stroll in town, Jack is approached by Officer Gina, who informs him about Joe and her brother. Threatened by the man, Jack goes to speak to his convict brother, Jimmy, and instructs him to keep Jilly away from them, showing him a picture of the man. Accepting his brother's order, Jimmy takes 2 of his friends and begins to search for Jilly. Having no idea about what was happening, Jilly begins to ask around town to find the hair salon Joe owned. After receiving directions, Jilly begins to make his way to the hair salon, but he is ambushed by Jimmy and his friends, who beat him up and send his unconscious body to Mexico. When he awakens, Jilly finds himself in a plane with dozens of foreigners. 2 days later, Valdine and Walter drive up to the town. Their daughter is about to get married in, leaving their newly discovered son behind so he doesn't raise suspicions. When they arrive at Jack's residence, he welcomes them in with open arms, ignoring the issue with Jilly. After the incident with Jimmy and his friend, Jilly arrives in town with a disguise. Heading over to Joe's shop, he meets her assistant, who tells him that Joe hadn't come to work due to her wedding. While Jilly is asking the man to give Joe a message, the assistant recognizes Jilly from the posters all around town and threatens to call the police. Fearful of being arrested, Jilly uses thrown-away hair to add a makeshift beard all over his face. He then heads to the nearby bar where he had dropped off Dig 2 days ago and finds the man drinking near the counter. After revealing himself and telling him what had happened, he mentions that Joe was marrying a man called Jack. Recognizing the powerful man, Dig warns Jilly not to mess with Jack, as he is a man with a lot of wealth and power. Dig also tells Jack that Joe had an amazing opportunity to marry this man and warns him not to ruin her chances for happiness. While preparing for her wedding in 2 days, Joe gets a phone call from her assistant, who informs her that Jilly has come to the shop. Realizing that he is struggling with everything, Joe decides to speak to Jilly and heads out, finding Jilly trying to get a ride. Surprised to see her there, Jilly expresses his happiness, but Joe doesn't share his enthusiasm. Recounting what her mother had said, she tells him that he needs to move on and accept the relationship they had. Jilly desperately wants to tell her the truth, but he remembers what Dig had told him and decides to hold his tongue. Saying his final goodbyes, Jilly lets Joe drive him to a nearby town so he can get a bus ticket back home. After driving off, Joe begins to cry, still feeling the love she had for Jilly. At a nearby station stop, Jilly is waiting in line to enter an awaiting bus when his ticket is stolen by a young boy. Chasing him down the road into a junkyard, Jilly is shocked when Dig appears out of nowhere and pulls him to the side, obvious that he had set up the young man. Once Jilly has calmed down, Dig tells Jilly that Jack is a very bad man and that Joe would not be safe with him. Telling him that he was only putting on a show for the people in town, Dig takes him to his cabin and reveals more dirt about Jack. He tells him that Jack acquired his wealth by selling illegal marijuana and that he was the biggest producer in the area. When they're about to sit down for a meal, the door of the cabin is kicked open and Jimmy and his friends walk in. Kidnapping Jilly, they take him deep in the wounds, planning to beat him up, but Jilly manages to temporarily escape when Jimmy accidentally misses his swing and hits his friend. Unwilling to let them catch him again, Jilly jumps into the river and swims his way back to Dig's cabin. Once he arrives, the two plan to reveal the truth to Joe by flying a banner across the wedding event. Once they have everything ready, Dig and Jilly ride in Dig's hybrid plane, unaware that a tree branch has ripped some of the message off. When they fly across the mansion where the wedding recital was being held, Jilly peeks out of the window and yells out to Joe could see the message, unaware that the important part of the banner was ripped off, assuring Joe that Jilly has gone insane. As soon as the plane lands, Jilly is put under arrest and taken to the mental asylum, everyone assuming that he has unnatural urges toward his sister. After an altercation with another inpatient, Jilly is put in an isolated room where Dig breaks him out by crawling through the vents. On their way to the wedding, they see Joe's real brother, Leon, driving past them and getting inside a local motel. Realizing that this is the proof that he needs to show Joe, Jilly leaves Dig to keep an eye on Leon while he finds Joe. On his way into town, Jilly runs into a herd of cows and accidentally gets his hand stuck deep in one of the cows' bowls. Dragging him along, the cows walk through the town, making the people standing to watch laugh at it. While he struggles to set himself free, Jilly hears Joe's voice, which makes him stop in his tracks. Trying to compose himself, Jilly tries to tell Joe that he has found Leon, but Joe still assumes that this person was a figment of Jilly's imagination. Telling him to leave her alone to have her own family, Joe leaves Jilly on the street and heads to her wedding. Giving up on the attempt to get Joe back, Jilly tries to hitch a ride back home but is ambushed by Jimmy's friend, who hits him over the head and drives off. While driving away in Jilly's old truck, the perp comes across Leon, who assumed that Jilly was driving the car and caused the accident, killing Jilly's attacker. Meanwhile, Joe has her wedding, despite her father's adamant wishes to reveal the truth about her brother. Fearing he would ruin the day, Valdine keeps him handcuffed in the room until the event is over. After the ceremony is over, the wedding is interrupted by officers who have arrived to inform Joe that her brother, Jilly, had died in a car accident. Devastated by the news, Joe begins to cry, assuming that Jilly had killed himself, but the sheriff reveals had caught the man who had caused the accident pulling out Leon of the car. Walter, who had managed to escape his wife's cuffs, appears from behind and tells Joe that Leon is her real brother. Walter also reveals that the whole plot was orchestrated by Valdine and Jack. Disgusted by what she had heard, Joe leaves the vicinity. After regaining consciousness, Jilly heads over to Dig's cabin, who was shocked to see him alive. After telling him everything that happened, Dig offers to get Jilly home on his plane. Meanwhile, Joe drives back to Indiana to say her goodbyes to Jilly by heading to his favorite place. After returning home, Jilly was able to get his old job back and was just arriving at the pet shelter when he saw Joe standing on the edge of the building. Rushing toward her, he climbs up the side of the building, calling out her name, and the two fall into a grateful embrace. Several weeks later, Joe and Jilly are married and are heading out of the church. On their way out, Detective Vic approaches the happy couple and reveals that he was finally able to find Jilly's real mother. Heading over to a limo, he opens a door, and a famous actress Jilly used to have a crush on walks out, putting shock on his face. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.